This is a story my dad told me about my late grandma, my mom's mom. I would have been too young to remember it, being that I was around 5 years old. My grandma was a great lady, but she did possess a lot of those quirky traits that are typical among grandmas. A funny personality, a slight nervousness about things, especially when it concerns the safety of her family and grandkids. Kind of a wild driver, and for the sake of this story, not mechanically inclined at all. So, this took place during the warm summer months of 2003, and everybody had converged on my house to celebrate my oldest sister's birthday. Aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, etc. At that time, my dad had a little commuter car that he would always park on the driveway. It was a black stick shift Honda Civic, a minor fact that is critical to the story. Apparently, some of us kids loved playing in my dad's car. He would never leave the keys in it or anything, but we'd sit inside and pretend to be grown-ups driving around. Sometimes we'd also pretend to be Paul Walker and Vin Diesel racing around Los Angeles. I know, not the safest thing to do by letting your kids play in your car, but we didn't know any better. Apparently after dinner, this is what my older brother and cousin were doing. Just hanging out in the old Civic, pretending they were hijacking semi-trucks full of DVD players. My grandma was sitting out on the front porch and my dad was doing some watering nearby. All was well when suddenly, there was a click-type sound, and the car started slowly rolling backwards. My grandma saw this, panicked, and ran for the car at lightning speed by tapping into some sort of granny superpowers. She got there before my dad and ripped the door open, jamming herself inside trying to reach for and grab the e-brake. Now I'm not sure why she didn't just tell my brother to rip the e-brake instead, but regardless, she wasn't able to quite grab it, and before she knew it, she got acquainted with the open door. Right quick, and it knocked her on her keister, forcing her to tumble down the driveway a little. My dad was right behind her when it happened, and it took all he had to not laugh, especially when my grandma popped right back up purely on adrenaline to make sure her grandbabies were okay, and to make sure the situation was handled. By that point, my dad had reached in and engaged the e-brake, bringing the car to a full stop. After it was all done, my dad could tell Grandma was pretty embarrassed. I guess they decided to keep the incident to themselves that day. My dad always chuckled when talking about this experience. He didn't do a good job of keeping it a secret though, against Granny's wishes. But she had a good sense of humor and probably didn't mind all that much. This story takes place back in the early 1970s. My parents, along with my little sister and I, were going camping for the weekend at one of our favorite campgrounds a couple hours south of our home. This campground was quaint with some good simple amenities, not too far from the main road, and it had great tree coverage, which gave it the feeling of being deep in the woods, even though it wasn't. We really liked spending time there. My parents had one of those pop-up style camping trailers, the kind that opened like an umbrella, giving you a surprising amount of room. And when done, the ends would fold back down on themselves, making the trailer pretty flat and small when not being used. My grandparents were also going, but they would be driving in their own car about 30 minutes behind us. They were just planning on spending Friday night into Saturday rather than the whole weekend. The drive was going great until about an hour in when my parents' car broke down, forcing them to pull off to the side of the road. This, of course, was before cell phones, but my parents figured all was not lost since my grandparents would be along shortly and they could stop to lend a hand. We were all just hanging out on the side of the road, sitting on the guardrail that stood maybe 2 feet tall. We were certain they would see us considering they knew what our car and trailer looked like. And with all of us standing outside waving them down, there's absolutely no way they'd miss us, right? Right? Soon enough, my parents spotted their car headed our way, and we all got up to give a friendly wave while waiting for them to stop. I remember feeling a sense of relief and rescue. My grandpa was fairly mechanically inclined, and I would have bet the farm that he could have fixed our car right quick. Their car got closer and closer, but for some reason it wasn't slowing down. Grandma and Grandpa must have been daydreaming or something because they blew right on past us. I'm fairly certain that my grandma even looked in our direction as they did so, but it didn't seem to matter. They just kept on driving down the road. My folks were just staring at each other, mouths agape in stunned amazement as Grandma and Grandpa disappeared into the distance. I think my dad even said, "What the hell?" Grandma and Grandpa had no idea anything was wrong until they got to the campsite and saw that we weren't there. They turned around and went back to look for us. By the time they found us, it was at least an hour later. Fortunately, Grandpa had his tools and was able to get our car running, and we continued our drive to the campground. Every time we tell that story, we all laugh so hard at the image of Grandma and Grandpa driving right past their family without a care in the world, oblivious to their plight. Back when towns had shared telephone lines, you could just pick up your receiver and listen in on all the phone calls in town. In my grandma's rural hometown, there was a nosy old woman named Murdy that was notorious for monitoring the goings-on of the town through listening in on all the phone calls. One time when my grandma's mom knew she was listening, she, my great-grandmother, stood on a chair, put her ass to the mic, and ripped a fart, then said, "Smell that, Murdy?" It's been told throughout the years to the point that when we were kids, when we'd fart, we'd yell, "Smell that, Murdy?" When I was a kid, my dad and grandpa used to love hitting the links. And as small kids without driver's licenses, my same-age cousin and I thought that being able to chauffeur them around in a golf caddy was just about the greatest thing in the world. Having kids of my own nowadays, I realized that my dad and grandpa had the patience of Job, with how terrible of drivers we must have been, constantly driving too close to lying balls and nearly running other people's balls over, parking in front of where they would be swinging their drivers, etc. Thinking back on it, I remember their demeanor would get more and more frustrated as the game would go on. By the 18 hole, my dad was well past yelling at my horrible driving skills and was ready to wring my neck. Many a time, each golf cart could hear yelling coming from the other cart, as our terrible driving skills drove our elders crazy. My dad and I would laugh at my grandpa yelling at my cousin, and they would laugh at my dad yelling at me. Ah, the delights of being an annoying, mush-headed kid. So this one time, my dad, grandpa, uncle, and older brother all decided to spend a Saturday afternoon shooting 9 holes at one of the local golf courses. They rented 3 carts, of course, and myself. And that same cousin of mine were overly excited to drive the carts. No amount of yelling would stop us from driving those carts. 2 funny-as-hell things happened that day. First, early in the game, one of the carts wasn't running right, so my grandpa drove it back with my uncle in the passenger seat and my cousin standing on the back hanging onto the roof frame. Well, grandpa wasn't paying attention and hit a nice abrupt dip, causing my cousin to bang his head on the roof of the golf cart and fall off the back. He rolled a few times before getting up to realize that grandpa and his dad hadn't noticed his sudden departure. He tore off after them, bawling his eyes out, and ran nearly a quarter mile before they turned around to see that he wasn't on there. My dad, older brother, and I all witnessed it and had to bite our lips when he came back, sniffling with a goose egg the size of a car on his head. The next thing to happen that day was the weather. The wind had started to pick up and a storm blew in pretty quickly. Before we knew it, horizontal rain started pelting us. My grandpa was up next to hit. And rather than wait it out in a golf cart with a roof and a windshield, he decided to just grab his umbrella and go for it. Anyways, right as he opens the umbrella, a massive gust of wind swells up, grabs the umbrella, and essentially bends it nearly inside out while pulling my grandpa down the green. I've never seen anything like it. It was sort of like whiskey throttle on a motorcycle, which is when the rider pulls the throttle too hard, causing the bike to lunge forward violently, only forcing the rider to pull the throttle even more. It's a vicious cycle that usually only ends in catastrophe. Well, Gramps probably ran 30 uncomfortable, knee-punishing, hip-breaking feet before the wind let up enough to halt his sprint. He didn't want to let the umbrella go and have it get stuck in some tree somewhere, plus the wind had some upward momentum, and that was helping to keep him on his feet, albeit on his running feet. I personally like to think he was fully committed to finishing his wild ride till the end. Full send. Grandpa, full send. After his gale force-powered adventure ended, he comes back, bent umbrella in hand, dropping curse words while laughing at himself. We all had a good laugh, honestly. It was one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Grandpa always had a great sense of humor and didn't take life too seriously. I only wish smartphones existed then, so we would have had a chance at recording and preserving it forever. Grandpa's been gone now for several years, but stories like these are a great way for us to preserve his memory. Rest in peace, Grandpa, rest in peace.